Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Bill Roach, and this is another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we discuss issues related to philosophy and apologetics and theology and culture and more. And what I want to do today is we're going to look at this issue of, is apologetics dead in a postmodern culture? And we have a special guest with us today. His name is Wokal Distance. And Wokal's a man that I met several months ago at a conference in Phoenix, Arizona, where he specifically addressed numerous topics related to postmodernism. And today what we're going to do is we're going to see and investigate this whole issue of, has postmodernism made apologetics irrelevant or useless? And do we still live in a modern world? And how should we deal with these issues of postmodernism? These are all questions that several people try to ask, and we're going to look for answers. Now, just a little brief intro here. This is a topic that I think many apologists attempt to address, but sometimes we don't actually understand the way that postmodernism is functioning today. So Wokal, I want to thank you for coming on the show here. And it is my privilege to be able to have this conversation with you and answer some of these questions for not only just the audience that may be here, but for the broader apologetics world and the church at large.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So like I said, we met a couple of months ago in Phoenix, and it was great to get to know you then. And I think everybody's going to appreciate so much of what you're going to do for us today. And if people want to follow you or sort of see what you're doing, where can you point them to in order to see the different works that you're doing?
I have a Twitter account, which is at Wokal_distance. So WOKAL_distance. And my I have a pinned tweet there that's pinned to a thread, which leads to my Substack, and you can find me there. So yeah, I most of my work, I would say, is on my Twitter, Substack. I've written for American Reformer. I work with the Center for Renewing America with Russ Vought. I've worked with Chris Rufo. So I'm a little all over the place, but the best place to find me is probably on Twitter.
And I would encourage all of you, please go follow him on Twitter. There he's going to give you several good long tweets where he's going to illustrate what we're going to talk about today in a variety of different ways on a day-to-day basis. So as we dive into this here, give us a brief outline of your background. How did you come to understand postmodernism and engage with postmodernism?
Well, so I'm from Saskatchewan, and I attended a Pentecostal church in Saskatchewan. So when I was done, I went to the Pentecostal college, which we do have. We have one, and it is fully accredited. And I got my Bachelor of Biblical Studies there. And at that time, all the rage was stuff like this. That's The Story We Find Ourselves In by Brian McLaren. And he wrote a whole series of books under the banner of, or in a series of books called A New Kind of Christian. And that was part of the Emergent Church. That was online on the internet. They had a website, I believe it was called The Emergent Village. And they were using postmodernism. And so at that time, it was people like Rachel Held Evans, Brian McLaren. Well, Evans was later, but Brian McLaren, Tony Jones, Rob Bell kind of got lumped in with them, as did Leonard Sweet. A lot of guys were kind of circling that milieu of writers. And that was a big deal at the time. So we studied it and looked at it. And that was kind of my introduction to postmodernism. It was that. And I mean, John Caputo wrote a book called What Would Jesus Deconstruct? And Brian McLaren wrote the foreword to it. So that was kind of my intro to postmodernism.
I think that was the intro for a lot of people in sort of that generation. And I'm in that generation. I went off to Bible college, and I remember the craze was these authors dealing with postmodernism and the mood that it seemed to communicate. They were always feeling like they were maybe pushing the edge, and they were furthering conversation and dialogue, but you could tell that there was something distinctly new, or maybe a new application of what they were trying to do. And, you know, one of the things that I think you brought up in a previous conversation is that you have actually studied these topics, not just at this sort of cultural level, but you've also studied them at a high university level. Is that correct?
Yeah. So after I finished up with my biblical studies degree because the idea was first I wanted to know my faith and then I wanted to go out into the world. So I went to the University of Regina and I studied philosophy. And a lot of what I studied was stuff like this. It was like A.J. Ayer, some logical positivism, John Austin's work of language, John Austin's work on speech acts, Donald Davidson. So that really rigorous, tough 60s, 70s, 80s analytic philosophy, Gareth Evans, Peter Strawson, all of that sort of stuff. That was really where I was kind of disciplined in philosophy. A lot of John Searle, who's a big influence on me. That was it. So there's these two kind of influences. I got the Pentecostal theology on the one hand, which is not necessarily, I admit, known for its rigor. And then on the other hand, really, really rigorous analytic philosophy dealing with modal logic, philosophy of language, symbolic logic, all of that sort of, first and second order predicate logic, all of that sort of thing. And so when I went to the university, at least in the analytic philosophy that I was studying, postmodernism had disappeared. But I noticed that when I went to the anthropology and sociology departments, it hadn't disappeared. And that was very interesting to me.
So you're saying that in many respects, not all disciplines were affected by postmodernism, but do you think it's still the same today? I mean, do you see expressions of postmodernism that may be cross-disciplinary in that sense in our university and culture at large?
So what I think happened is, why don't we do it like this? So I went from my theology, biblical studies degree to philosophy. When I went out into the workforce and got a job, I was doing research and writing. I was aware of a thing called the Sokal hoax, where a guy named Alan Sokal, who was a physicist, wrote some nonsense papers to prove that with the right jargon, and if you used enough technical vocabulary, you could say totally false things, but people would defer to you and say, well, he's an expert. He's using technical jargon. We should trust him. And he proved that you could publish meaningless nonsense or abject falseness if you used the correct technical jargon and you had the aura of expertise. And that was in the 90s. And he then wrote a book after that talking about postmodernism and how it was a pile of nonsense and how it should be gotten rid of. And this was part of the so-called science wars in the 90s. So fast forward to 2018 and out comes the grievance studies affair. And that was James Lindsay, Helen Pluckrose, and Peter Boghossian. And they didn't publish one paper in an academic journal. They published seven papers in academic journals, all of which contained absurd conclusions. One of them postulated that dog parks in Portland are petri dishes of rape culture, and that one of the ways to deal with men is to use the same techniques that we use to train dogs. I mean, really absurd stuff. They rewrote a chapter of Adolf Hitler's book Mein Kampf, but they rewrote it in the language of social justice and they swapped out the word Jews for like straight white males, and they swap out the various elements so that it changed. But the ideas were all kind of the same. And all of a sudden, that got published in a high-level journal. So I looked at this and I said, okay, so this postmodern stuff, it really has spread through the academy. And maybe we could have a conversation about exactly how it did that.
That's exactly what I want to do today. And what I want to do is see how do we get from this idea of old hard school postmodernism into the emergent church, into the grievance studies projects, and how does that affect apologetics? And, what I want to do is two things before we dive into this conversation. I want these to kind of be two things that we can hang our mind on with illustrations. And the first one is that I want you to tell us this illustration that you gave a couple of months ago on what is postmodernism. And it was this whole analogy that you gave with a car. Because one of the things I want people to do is not only have a definition of postmodernism, but I want a picture for them. I want them to think about postmodernism in a particular way. So how can you explain postmodernism to people who may not have a real working understanding, but they need a good picture of what it may look like?
So that was an analogy and I said this in my talk, I took that directly from George Carlin. Now, he probably wouldn't, I mean, he was an ardent atheist, so he wouldn't be agreeing with my apologetics at all, so let's be clear. But his analogy is perfect. And I don't even think he meant it as an analogy. He was just talking about the different ways we get disoriented. And he was poking fun at things like you walk down a set of stairs, you skip a step by accident, and you fall. So what do? You have to like put on the wall, hands on the wall. Or you think there's an extra step and there isn't. Or you go to pick up a suitcase and it's empty, but you think it's full, and so you lose your balance. And he's telling a bunch of these stories, and they're all kind of humorous. But the one that he picked up on that I really liked was he said, have you ever been seen two trains beside each other and one train starts moving and you're not sure which one it is? And the same thing can happen in your car. You're sitting in your car and one car starts moving and you're not sure which car it is, whether it's you or the guy next to you. So I'm going to do something with that. And this will be my explanation of what postmodernism is like. This is an analogy of postmodernism. You're driving your car, you pull up to a stoplight, and you're stopped. And there's a car next to you. And then the car next to you starts moving. And for a split second, you're not sure whether it's the car next to you that's moving or whether it's you that's moving. You get a little disoriented, so you tap the brake. But the car next to you keeps moving. So what do? You look around at the things around you to orient yourself. So you might look at a mountain or a building or a sidewalk or a street light or a lamppost or something to orient yourself so you know, did my brakes just fail or is this guy starting to move? Okay? That's what we would do. And this would be the same thing. I mean, I've had this happen where I'm sitting at a stoplight and the guy in front of me starts to back up. And for a moment, I think my brakes have failed. What do? I look around and go, oh, well, that house there isn't moving. I'm not moving relative to that house. So this guy in front of me must be backing up. And I know that I got to start backing up or he's going to hit me. So now imagine that you're sitting at the stoplight and you're stopped and the guy next to you stopped and the guy next to you again starts moving. And for a split second, you're not sure whether he's moving or whether you're moving. You get a little disoriented, so you tap your brake. Or the guy in front of you starts getting closer to you and you go, wait, is he backing up or did my brakes just fail? So what do? You tap your brake. Now, suppose you tap the brake and the guy next to you is still moving and the guy in front of you is still getting closer to you. So you're like, are these guys moving or am I moving? What's going on here? So what do? You look around and you look for a building or a stoplight or a mountain or a tree or whatever it is. Now imagine this. The tree is moving. The building's moving. The sidewalk's moving. The lamp posts, the light posts, the street signs are all moving and all the buildings are moving. Now what? Now you're completely disoriented. That's the postmodern world. In the postmodern world, there are no absolute points of reference. There are no objective, universal, absolute truths. Nothing is unchanging. There are no absolute objective standards. Everything is moving. Everything is changing. There are no foundations. That's the idea I want people to have. In the same way that if you were sitting in your car and the car next to you started moving and you tapped your brake and he kept moving and you didn't know whether he was moving or you were moving and you try to orient yourself and the buildings are floating around and the mountains are sliding back and forth and the trees are wobbling, you'd get disoriented in that world pretty quickly. That's also what's happening in the postmodern world.
And I think that's a lot of the things that many Christian apologists have picked up on over the years. Namely, they see what this does to the Christian faith, that if there is no absolute standard, then it's not true that the Bible is the Word of God or that Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And it's not true of any historical fact, more or less these specific religious facts. And, there was a time where evangelicals saw this issue and they tried to respond to it. They saw this this harder form of postmodernism.
Yes.
And one of the things that we're going to look at today is that postmodernism doesn't just have one standard era in which it lives. And this is going to give us our second analogy to understand the way that this functions. And, you know, one thing that I have is I have an extensive background in martial arts training. And like one of the things you see here is a samurai. Like I love that whole concept of, you know, the Japanese soldier and what they've done to train themselves to deal with specific issues, and they're true warriors in every sense of the term. And one thing that's interesting is that the samurai, or Japan in and of itself, was the only country that wasn't overtaken by the Mongols in their conquest. And they can say that it happened like that for a couple of reasons. One was the fact that like a big storm came in and the Mongols were off into the sea, and it deterred them from coming on shore. That was one key issue. But another aspect of it is that the samurai were so well equipped and trained fighters that the Mongols didn't really know what to do. And in many respects, that represents this idea of how apologetics has functioned. It's been this very precise, articulate way of dealing with very specific issues, namely the ones that they were equipped to deal with. Now, let's continue this a little bit more.
Okay.
Now, things weren't always that way with the samurai. In fact, the biggest thing that changed was not when the Mongols came to their shore. It's when Westerners showed up and they brought guns with them. And all of a sudden they realized that if my battle is a sword fight, it works. But when the weapons changed and the attacks started to change, they either had to adapt or they were done. And it's not that the weapons of the past were irrelevant. It's not like those things can't be used anymore, but now you have to deal with guns and you have to deal with cannons being shot at you. And this is what I want you to see from this, is that the samurai represents in many respects sort of this apologetic. You have people that are dealing with these hard issues and these topics of, does God exist? Is the Bible reliable? Did Jesus rise from the dead? But now we're dealing with new ships coming aboard and abroad. And these are figures almost bringing new weapons, new guns. And we could stretch this analogy out where you could have people that could say, well, I'm used to traditional fighting. You stand up and we throw punches at one another. And then what happened? Like UFC comes around, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu comes onto the scene, and people realize, oh my goodness, my traditional striking or my traditional wrestling doesn't work. People are putting me in triangle chokes and omoplatas and kimuras and all these different things. And this is what we're finding ourselves in, is that the point that I want you to see with this illustration is that we're not saying that the classical approaches don't have their place. And we're not saying that evidence and reason are useless in every contour. Rather, we're trying to have a conversation about how we can continue to maybe do apologetics in light of the fact that postmodernism is in our society. And in fact, I would say that postmodernism is probably growing more today than it is sort of leaving all these different contours. Look at society. Don't just look at where the academy is. Look at where society is. So that's why we're asking this question: is apologetics dead? So now you gave me a reference here in order to look at this. And you've said that there are two key figures that have looked at this issue of apologetics. And one is saying that postmodernism is dead for apologetics, and another one is saying that it's possibly relevant. Who are those two figures? And we're going to look at a video from one here.
Okay, so I think what might be useful is just to give a brief, just to salt the ground, I guess, or not salt the ground, to till the soil a little bit with, to fertilize the ground, to prep the ground for what we're going to do. Postmodernism didn't get a hold in American universities through philosophy or the sciences. It came in mostly through the humanities, arts, literature, the fine arts.
The social sciences in that sense. Yeah.
And then it moved into the social sciences, the anthropology, sociology. A lot of them picked up on it. So postmodernism did not begin in analytic philosophy, which is why I think a lot of analytic philosophers who spend most of their time there don't see it. Ricky Wilson's in Queer Theory, Gender Theory, and Ricky Wilson's is a radical trans activist, talks about the conquering of the academic world by postmodernism, and just straight up says it, that this is what has happened because the radical theories of the trans activists and the queer theorists all rely on a version of postmodernism. And so that postmodernism came in through the 80s, was picked up on by social theorists, I would say in the late 80s, early 90s, and then it was brought from there into the anthropology, into sociology, into other various departments in the late 90s and the 2000s. So there's been a development of this. It didn't happen overnight and for no reason. I think that when we talk about postmodernism, there is a tendency. I want to read something by Brian McLaren, of all people. And he says this, he says, one of the frequent causes for misunderstanding in the postmodern conversation has been the tendency of some to freeze the definition of postmodern in its earliest, most deconstructive phase. Then, anything that became slightly more constructive had to be named postmodern and so on. Since I'm using the term to describe an unfolding, evolving, unfrozen, and in fact biased against freezing mindset, I've also always considered specificity, authenticity, and values as inherent in postmodernity. What that means, actually we should read his last sentence. All this serves as a reminder that if we must be labeled, we are wiser to identify ourselves with labels that indicate an evolving way rather than a frozen location. One of the problems is a number of philosophers look at the early form of postmodernism with its so-called anti-realist epistemology, and it's kind of playful nihilistic deconstruction, and they say, look, this could never work, it's totally unlivable, it's completely ridiculous, no one could ever believe it. And yeah, if you push the early deconstructive thinking to its logical end, you do kind of end up there. But the postmoderns were aware of that. And so postmodernism grew and changed. It made alterations to itself. And it was wedded with critical theory. So Mark Lila in the New York Review of Books talks about how academic postmodernism in the late 90s and 2000s is this odd mixture where you have everything from Gilles Deleuze, Michael Foucault, Jacques Derrida, all the way to Theodore Adorno, Max Horkheimer, Herbert Marcuse. And he says, well, what's going on here? All these ideas are completely different. There's a hodgepodge. They don't fit together exactly. They're in some ways contradictory. These thinkers have different disagreements, and yet they're all being cited and cross-referenced with each other. Sometimes thinkers who oppose each other in certain parts of their work are cited in the same work. Well, how's that going on? And what he says is that the thing that unites the academic milieu of postmodernism is a shared commitment to an ill-defined conception of liberation or emancipation on the political left. John Searle, the analytic philosopher, when in a defense of the Western rationalistic tradition, talks about this, and he says that a lot of this stuff has been excoriated as relativism and nihilism. He says, but a better term for it is actually politically motivated subjectivism. There's a political axe to grind here. There is a moral vision that they're trying to impose on the world, and postmodernism was the acid that they were using to deconstruct the Enlightenment liberal tradition and the tradition, the broad Western rationalistic tradition that goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle. They wanted to get rid of that because, as Searle notes in his work, they rightly perceive that as being an impediment to the imposition of their social vision. In other words, your social vision is wrong and relies on false assumptions, and the arguments for its implementation can be debunked and defeated through the Western rationalistic tradition. So instead of adjusting your vision to suit reality, you've decided to attack the standards of evidence, logic, and reason which point out that your beliefs are false. In other words, you're tearing down all the standards of rationality because they stand in the way of your politically motivated vision.
So do you think that their task is dead today? I mean, are they alive and well? I think this is questions that people ask. And, you know, when we look at society, it seems like this is very pervasive. You know, when we were having our conference, we were looking at the effects of this with critical theory and how it's affecting evangelical seminaries and publishing houses and seemingly the local church and various denominations as a whole. Now, I want to play a clip here by somebody that I think would disagree with you. And I want to interact with this because I think it's going to illustrate the point that some are seeing like Wokal here, this real effect of postmodernism and the way that it's being engaged through the social sciences. And I'm going to pull up a video here by William Lane Craig that he actually pointed me to in order to look at this issue of whether or not postmodernism is dead. And Craig actually thinks that it is. So let's play it, use that as a springboard to discuss whether or not postmodernism has made apologetics dead today or not. So here we go. Let's pull this up.
Just to be clear, I don't think he thinks apologetics is dead. I think he thinks postmodernism is dead. It's been left behind. Okay. Yeah. Let's listen to it.
Describe that.
Well, I don't think that it was all that different than it is today. You see, I don't agree or think that we live in a postmodern culture. I think that our culture in the West remains at heart deeply modernist. And the worldview is basically that science and technology give us the objective truth about the world, but that religion and ethics are a matter of personal taste and emotive expression. And that was the view back then, and I think it's pretty much still the same way today.
Yeah.
People are not relativistic about medicine, science, technology, about ethics and religion. And you see, that's not postmodernism, that's modernism.
Right. No, that's good. So then would you say that just the values have shifted then, if not the worldview of the culture?
So let's stop there real quick. Wokal, how do you interact with that? What do you see him saying there right now? What filters go through your mind as somebody who's deeply entrenched with the literature of postmodernism? What would you say to a person like Bill Craig? He's obviously trying to save apologetics. He's saying apologetics is alive and well, but postmodernism is dead. What would you say to that?
The very first thing I would say is that Bill Craig is an icon and one of my heroes. I've got some of his books on my shelf right now. The Kalam cosmological argument is one of the most talked about arguments in apologetics. It's probably the most important argument in apologetics in the past 50 years, with the possible exception, say, of Alvin Plantinga's with the possible exception of somebody maybe like Alvin Plantinga's work on the problem of evil or Peter Van den Wagen's work on free will. I mean, Bill Craig is right up there in his level of importance.
Exactly.
And so if there's a certain level of trepidation that I have in trying to say that Bill Craig is wrong about something. So, Bill Craig did do some really great work in dealing with John Caputo. So John Caputo was a postmodern philosopher in the 1980s. So maybe we'll go through this in a bit of a story form so that you can see how I would respond. Caputo wrote Radical Hermeneutics in the 80s. I believe it was in 1987 it was first published. And
right there.
Yeah, that's the one. That's it.
Yep.
And in that book, he says several times that the truth is that there is no truth. And I believe it was in the Blackwell Companion to Theology, Bill Craig excoriated him for this several times and knocked around his postmodernism pretty good, which I read and I loved. And so in terms of excoriating that sort of old line deconstructive postmodernism, Bill Craig is, I think, right. The playful postmodernism of the 70s and 80s is gone. I don't think we're living in that culture. But that's not because postmodernism's dead. I think that's because postmodernism isn't playing around anymore. So, My contention is that a good way... Oh, how do I do this? Let's go about it like this. And I'm gonna use just a brief line of thinking so that you guys can follow, so that people can follow it through. And I'm going to use that as a kind of a stand-in or a paradigm case of what I'm going to argue for. Okay. So,
Okay.
in contingency, irony, and solidarity, Richard Rorty says this. He says, to fend off suspicions, I need to argue that the distinctions between absolutism and relativism, between rationality and irrationality, and between morality and expediency are obsolete and clumsy tools, remnants of a vocabulary we should try to replace. So what he's saying here is he says absolutism and relativism, rationality, irrationality, morality, expediency, these are all clumsy vocabulary, bad distinctions, we want to replace them. But argument is not the right word. For on my account of intellectual progress, as the literalization of selected metaphors, rebutting objections to one's redescriptions of some things will be largely a matter of redescribing other things, trying to outflank the objections by enlarging the scope of one's favorite metaphors. So my strategy will be to try to make the vocabulary in which these objections are phrased look bad, thereby changing the subject, rather than granting the objector his choice of weapons and terrain by meeting his criticisms head on. So he's talking here about people that are going to object to his jettisoning of the absolutism relativism distinction or the rationality irrationality distinction. When you object to him, he is going to, and I quote, my strategy will be to try to make the vocabulary in which these objections are phrased look bad, thereby changing the subject, rather than granting the objector his choice of weapons and terrain by meeting his criticisms head on. That's not an argument. He just says, what are you going to do? Well, I'm going to make your vocabulary look, I'm going to make your vocabulary look bad. Then I will change the subject and deny you your vocabulary and your distinctions. How about that?
It seems to be a mood or a method more than an actual argument, but
that's right.
That seems to be what takes place today, is that people try to use this as a method to get you where they want and to make you feel a particular way about something versus give you a rational argument. I mean, that seems to be society at large today.
That's why Mark Leela said postmodernism was long on attitude and short on argument.
That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. So that's what Rorty says. Well, here's John Caputo. He says, you can't settle metaphysical debates, and so I concede that there's no stopping someone from holding an Augustinian two worlds view. The way you can't stop someone from believing in guardian angels, demonic possession, or alien abductions. All you can do, as Rorty said, is try to discourage it by making it look bad and offering a more persuasive alternative. In this case, a way of reimagining God and reinventing Christianity. So that's Caputo, right? Let's read it again. I concede that there's no stopping someone from holding an Augustinian two worlds view, the way you can't stop someone from believing in guardian angels, demonic possession, or alien abductions. All you can do, as already said, is try to discourage it by making it look bad and offering a more persuasive alternative. Okay, but I want to really hammer this home. Because Caputo, in that same article, says, the classical doctrine of omnipotence effectively ruins the deconstructive idea of the impossible and also of God for Derrida. And that is why I wrote a book against it, to which my astonishment is left conspicuously unread. The classical doctrine of omnipotence effectively ruins the deconstructive idea of the impossible and also of God for Derrida, and that is why I wrote a book against it. So, in the same article where he says, I acknowledge that we can't give an argument against it, against certain things, the Augustinian two worlds view, all we can do is make it look bad. He also admits that he's jettisoning the classical doctrine of omnipotence. Okay?
That makes sense.
Let's hold that. That's where Caputo's going. So what are we seeing here? We're seeing this mood. Okay. So now we're going to move to Searle. This is John Searle writing. He says there's an ambiguity in Rorty's claim that truth is made and not discovered. Since truth is always in the form of true statements and true theories, and indeed true statements and true theories have to be made and formulated by human beings. But it does not follow from this fact that there's no independently existing reality to which their statements and theories correspond. In a word, true statements are made, but the truth of the statements is not made, it's discovered. Rorty's argument is typical of these discussions, is that more is insinuated than is actually argued for. What is claimed, I guess, is that the true statements, like all statements, are made by human beings. What is insinuated is much more serious, that there are no facts in the real world that make our statements true, and perhaps the real world is just our creation. So again, we're seeing Rorty say, look, I'm just going to make you look bad. We see Caputo saying, hey, that's a great idea. I think I'll use that. And by the way, we're getting rid of omnipotence. And then we have Cyril coming along and calling the bluff and saying, hey, look, man, you guys are insinuating these things. You're not straightforwardly arguing for them. You're just insinuating it. All you do is couch your propositions in a way that makes other people look bad. That is what is going on here. Okay? So let's pull that forward now into contemporary reality and ask about, I don't know, Jesus and John Wayne by Kristen Cobbs-Dumay. At the end of that book, she talks about how what can be done and what has been done can be undone. And the statement is kind of ambiguous because it's not clear what she means. Is she talking about the theology? Because she never gives an argument against the theology. What is Jesus and John Wayne? It is an analysis of evangelical culture that brings up all the sins of the past and all the bad things about it. It does a reading of that and says that evangelicalism is the culture, not the theology. She even says that explicitly. She says evangelical culture should be understood in terms of its political and cultural valence, not in terms of its theological beliefs. And then she concludes by saying, with a normative claim, that what can be done must be undone. And the subtitle of the book is also normative, that evangelicals fractured a nation, as if they had no help, as if this group of people, which has very little social cachet and does not at all run any of our institutions or elite sense-making of our elite universities or of our elite sense-making institutions, or indeed any of our cultural institutions that have real cultural cachet. They don't run Hollywood. They don't run any of the social media companies. They don't run any of the major infrastructure companies. I mean, we have Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A. Not exactly running the culture, are we? But she makes
changing things.
She makes the normative claim, but where's the argument? It's all insinuated. She just leads you to the doorstep and says, well, the conclusion's right there. What must be done, what has been done must be undone. And it's this litany of complaints. But there's a normative dimension to her. It's a strong normative dimension to her work, both in her, what does she call it? Free indirect discourse. The snide tactics that she used to make her opponents look bad, the sort of blend of irony and sarcasm that she uses, that she pulls off using some of the similar techniques of Jane Austen, but it's not argued for. She never goes through and says, this biblical proposition is false, or this particular interpretation of a verse is false. What she does is she attempts to make them look bad.
Which goes back to your saying, what?
Yeah.
Yeah, which goes back to your saying, what are they? They're low on argument and high on what? What was
right.
that saying that you
That's
used?
right. That's Mark Lila. That's they're short on argument. They're long on attitude and short on argumentation. Right? It's really posturing.
So let's try to break this down a little bit more for people to understand. So what you're saying is that a figure like maybe William Lane Craig is dealing with one form of postmodernism,
That's right.
But postmodernism, by its definition, it's evolving, it's changing,
yes,
and it's by definition. So when he's saying that it no longer affects us, or like, no, we don't live in a postmodern world, he's dealing with a very particular, almost static definition of postmodernism.
Yes.
And that's what we're not facing today. And this is part of the conversation that I want people within the apologetics world to see, is that we live in this world of clear definitions and clear arguments, and we lay them out in a particular way. But postmodernism, even with its own theory in and of itself, allows the definitions of postmodernism and the mood of postmodernism to constantly be shifting and changing, sort of back
That's
to your
right.
analogy. The car is moving, the car next to you is moving, the tree is moving, the mountain's moving, and all the rest. And what we mean by this is that even postmodernism is moving. So
That's right.
At one point in time, you gave us these different types of postmodernism, and what I want to do is flesh those out a little bit, because I think what's happening, to speak in the language of many apologists, is that we're equivocating on our definitions and concepts of postmodernism, and we don't see that they're fluid in and of themselves. So you talked about 3 different levels of postmodernism.
Yeah.
Can you just briefly say, what are those 3, and then go back and explain them quick for us here?
Okay, so we'll do it this way. James Lindsay and Helen Pluckrose, in their book Cynical Theories, and I want to give credit where it's due, say that there are 3 stages to postmodernism. There's the high deconstructive phase. That's the early phase, which would, the way that they understand it, because you could say postmodernism, depending on how you define the term, you could run it all the way back to Nietzsche. Grenz traces it back to Nietzsche. But in terms of the academic postmodernism and the way that it's influenced society now, the high deconstructive phase basically runs from when, I would say 1967, when Derrida gives his talk called Structure, Sign, and Play at Johns Hopkins, 1967. That talk, I believe it was at Johns Hopkins. Yeah, that talk kind of kicks it off. The post-structuralist phase, which is tied in heavily with postmodernism. And that runs probably right through the mid-'80s. In the late 80s, you start seeing postmodern themes, ideas, and theories being picked up by other people. So, for example, Kimberly Crenshaw, the critical race theorist, in her work on intersectionality, picked up postmodernism and said that intersectionality is a provisional concept that provides a link between postmodern theory and progressive politics. In fact, she says that twice. Once in the original paper that she wrote on it, I believe Mapping the Margins was what it's called, and also in the anthology or the book Words That Wound, which was in 1991. She says that in the main body of the text there. So twice she says that intersectionality bridges those 2 concepts. It gets picked up by Sandra Harding, who says in an interview that standpoint epistemology, feminist standpoint epistemology, is a form of postmodernism. And it does contain themes of relativism. If you cash out the world in Enlightenment terms, she goes, yeah, it does contain subjectivism and relativism, although she's trying to kind of deconstruct that binary, right? Mm-hmm. So you see that these ideas of postmodernism are getting picked up and churned and used. I believe it was Angela Harris that said that in 91, who said that the critical race theorists were attempting to use postmodernism to deconstruct in the light of modernism. As in, they wanted to have the liberalist modern light kind of shining on the world, and in that light, but still be doing their deconstructive work. And so that they were using these things. And so what you end up with is a picture of the world where that straight mainline deconstructive postmodernism is no longer the thing that's really being brought out. It's been tempered, and it's been grafted in with other theories in order to try and make it stable enough to build on. That's why Brian McLaren, in that piece I read earlier, said that they're being constructive now. They're now attempt to build they're trying to build using postmodern tools and a postmodern view of the world. They've realized that 80s kind of deconstructive postmodernism just wipes out everything. So now they're moving forward with something else. Now they're trying to construct while maintaining that postmodern view of the world.
Okay, I know you said that there's like this high deconstructionism. Would you consider this second one applied applied postmodernism in
Yeah.
that sense.
That's,
And how
yes.
does that differ from, you've used this in conversation before, this concept of reified postmodernism. So what's the difference between high postmodernism, applied postmodernism, and reified postmodernism? Those are three different phrases you hear people talk about there.
In Feminism, Science, and Anti-Enlightenment Critiques, Sandra Harding, I won't read it because it would take too long to read, but she talks about this. She says she wants to obliterate the objectivist viewpoint, by that the Enlightenment liberal view, because she says, look, you're not objective, neutral, unbiased. No. You've been socialized in a capitalist, racist, sexist, homophobic, bigoted society. And because of your status and position as a white heterosexual male, that is going to determine in some significant way the questions you ask, the beliefs you hold, the method of investigation, who you take seriously, who you don't take seriously. And so she says, this is just, no. But she also says that the interpretationists, or interpretationism as she calls it, that just say, well, every interpretation is good as any other interpretation, is no good. She says, that's terrible. And you want to know why it's terrible? Well, she says it's terrible because how are we supposed to do feminist politics if every interpretation is as good as every other one? And so she says, we have to have something that justifies our ability to be able to argue in our interests. We have to ground our feminist epistemologies in something that isn't just pure interpretationism, where my view is no better than the white male view, is no better than the black female view, is no better than everyone's view is as good as every other view. Well, she says we can't do that because that doesn't allow us to pursue what we're after. So what do? She says we ground it in our identity.
Oh, that's a key distinction there. So you're saying that one of the key distinctions between sort of this higher sort of deconstructionism into this sort of newer forms of applied postmodernism is the shift in where they're grounding things. One is doing a work of tearing apart, but now they realize, that doesn't really work. And they're trying to ground things in different identities. Like what kind of identities would they put them in? So I mean, obviously she's doing it in a feminist identity. What other things might they do with it?
Yeah. So how do I put this? So what she's going to end up doing, and this is an idea that was being pursued by Kimberly Crenshaw kind of in the same way, in the same vein. So following from the postmodern view of the world, if you go back, so we should just take a step back. The original insight from Derrida is that Derrida says there are no essences. There are no substances. There's no forms. There's no spirits. There's nothing like that. It's radical anti-essentialism in I think, not just in some sense, in every sense of the word. Mm-hmm. There are no forms. There are no godlike crystalline categories that come out of the world and divide the world up in a clean way. There is no objective view of the world that one can have. There is, in effect, no center. Derrida thinks there's no linchpin. There's no objective point of reference that anyone can occupy. There is nothing which sits at the center of reality. Reality is just what Stanley Grenz calls a centerless flux. There's no one thing which defines everything else. Because that you'd be making that one thing privileged, right? So there is no thing. So in Paper Machine, Derrida actually, because he was excoriated as a relativist, but he says, quote, as for the relativism they're supposed to be worried about, well, even if this word has a rigorous philosophical meaning, there's not a trace of it in my writing. Well, why does he say that? Well, the answer turns out to be that if you're a relativist, in the way that he's talking about here, the relativist says, here's the culture and everything is relative to the culture. Or here's the language and everything is relative to the language. Or here's your opinion and things are relative to your opinion, right? That's the idea of relativism. He's saying, no, it's not that everything is relative, it's that there's différence is his term. And what he means by that, it's a French expression. He says, look, things just differ from other things. Everything is defined by everything else. everything is just context. So there is no central pillar which provides the objective point of reference. There are just infinite perspectives and infinite points of reference and infinite ways of breaking up the world. So there are no essences. So in Derrida's view, or the view that was taken from him, although I wouldn't say that he would necessarily have ascribed to this, it's more the case that we can break up the world in whatever way we want, for whatever reasons we want, in whosever interests we want. So you take that Derridian idea that there's no objective viewpoint, that no text has anything in the center of it that holds its meaning in place. There isn't anything in the text that holds its meaning, according to Derrida. Meaning is a matter of context. So what Derrida would say is, I have to be careful here. When you deconstruct a text, the text doesn't change. What you're doing when you're deconstructing the text is getting rid of the presuppositions and assumptions. You're reading the text in this anti-essentialist way. You're reading the text so that you understand there isn't one singular meaning in the text that needs to be dug up and pulled out the way we excavate, say, dinosaur bones or dig up a buried treasure. Rather, what's happening is you're reading the text and understanding that the meaning of the text exists in the interpretive engagement that I'm having with the text in a particular context.
Sort of like a dialogical process that's going in.
That's right.
Would it be fair to even say like a dialectical process that we could say?
Yeah, that would be a loaded word we'd have to use, but yes. Yeah, I think you'd say that. And so you take that view, and all of a sudden there is no objectively correct way to interpret a text. And Derrida takes that and he says, and again, we're blazing over some things, but he says what applies to the text is what applies to the world. He says when you read the world, when you look out at the world, what do? You interpret the world the same way you interpret a text. How do you interpret the world? Through what? Through context. I know that's a tree because it's taller than that bush, but it's shorter than the skyscraper. I know that's a baby because it's smaller than the human, but it's bigger than the mouse, and it's wearing a diaper, and blah, 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 blah. It's all how things relate to other objects. And in the way that these things relate to each other is how I engage in my interpretation. But my interpretation is a product of my socialization as well. And so I've been socialized to see the world a certain way, and somebody else from a different culture has been socialized to see the world a different way. And why should the world be broken up according to my way of viewing the world? Somebody else might break up the world a different way. And so there's this idea that it's Derrida's going to say it's not that he denies that there's an objective world. When people call Derrida an anti-realist, Derrida would never have accepted that. What Derrida would say is, look, I'm not denying there's an objective world. I'm just saying there's an infinite number of interpretations of that objective world, and none of those interpretations has any claim to being privileged objectively over other interpretations. It's just that the various interpretations will serve and are useful for various different ends.
So if somebody were to say that they have a privileged interpretation on that, would he consider that like a power claim or a power struggle of some sort?
Yes.
And what is that? I mean, okay. And what does that look like? Like, how does that, you have two different people sitting in, say, a social situation, and they interpret it in two different ways. How does that power concept work its way out in applied postmodernism?
Okay. So they would pull from the work of Michael Foucault, who said that truth and power are two features of, or knowledge and power more accurately, are two features of the same object. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means is, he says, to boil it down to its simplest form so that we can move forward, the truth and power are always intertwined and they can't be pulled apart. Truth, says Foucault, is a social process. What people believed was true in the first century is different than what they believed in the 10th century. And what they believed in the 10th century was true is different what they believed in the 20th century. what we believe in the 21st century will be different in 100 years. So, says Foucault, there isn't an objective truth that exists. Truth is more like a social status. It's something like that. Truth is more like a status that is bestowed upon things by people. And what that turns out to mean is that there's certain procedures and processes which are used for determining truth. And those procedures and processes, says Foucault, are going to turn out to be warped, corrupted, shot through with, mixed in with, intertwined with the interests, biases, agendas, and goals of the people who are running those procedures. So Foucault's going to say, look, you're not some neutral observer standing there from nowhere figuring out what's true. Rather, truth is, and he says this explicitly, just a procedure for ordering statements, for the production and ordering of statements. That's all it is. He says, look, truth is, a society determines truth by having a particular procedure for bestowing the status of true on certain propositions and ideas. And that procedure is a procedure that was created socially. And the people who created that procedure, whether it's science, might be one procedure for truth, or math might be a procedure for truth. He says the people that create science, the people that create math, those people all have a certain social location. Those people all have a certain worldview. Those people are all themselves the product of social construction. And therefore, those people are not neutral arbiters outside. Those people are creating science and technology and math and engineering, and they have their own interests, biases, blind spots, agendas, etc., which are in some way determining the directions they'll go, the questions they'll ask, the people they'll take seriously, the people they won't take seriously, the methods of reasoning which they find valid, the methods of reasoning that they don't find valid, and so on and so forth.
Would you say this is what we're finding in sort of these feminist interpretational concepts, and
Yes.
like you were talking about with the previous
100%.
author there? So how does this differ from reified postmodernism? So you had your high, your applied, and reified. Like, what is reified? What do you mean by that? Like the basic definition, if somebody were to ask you, what is that?
So we're going to talk about that, but we need to do a little bit of a detour first.
Okay.
So we need to knock something out because this is going to come up and give us trouble later. Jean-François Lyotard said that postmodernism could be described as incredulity toward meta-narratives. And so one of the paradigmatic definitions of postmodernism is that postmodernism denies meta-narratives. And the idea has always been, and lots of people have made this point, the YouTuber ContraPoints has made this point, many people have said, you can't have postmodernism and Marxism mixed together because Marxism is a meta-narrative and postmodernism denies the validity of any meta-narratives. It's
so they would say that would be incompatible in some sense, is what they're claiming. Yeah.
But this, I think, and I think I'm going to pull this up and read it because it's just so darn good. This, I think, runs afoul of a misunderstanding of the way that postmodernism and social justice have sort of been brought together in a certain way. So I'm going to read what Leela says here. And this is just beautiful. He says, so he's going to talk about, Mark Leela's going to say something about Derrida's thinking and postmodernism and how it relates to these other ideas. In the United States, however, his ideas, that is Derrida's ideas, which were first introduced into literary criticism, now circulate in the alien environment of academic postmodernism, which is a loosely structured constellation of ephemeral disciplines like cultural studies, feminist studies, gay and lesbian studies, science studies, and post-colonial theory. Academic postmodernism is nothing if not syncretic, which makes it difficult to understand or even describe. It borrows notions freely from the translated works of Derrida, Michel Foucault, Gilles Deleuze, Jean-François Lyotard, Jean Baudrillard, and Julia Kristeva, and, as if that were not enough, also seeks inspiration from Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, and other figures from the German Frankfurt School. Given the impossibility of posing any logical order on ideas as dissimilar of these, postmodernism is long on attitude and short on argument. What appears to hold it together is the conviction that promoting these very different thinkers somehow contributes to a shared emancipatory political end, which remains conveniently ill-defined. So, the first series of thinkers, Lyotard, Baudrillard, Foucault, Deleuze, are all postmodernists. Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, Marcuse from the German Frankfurt School, those are neo-Marxists. And he's saying all of this stuff is mixed together. Why? Because it leads, they think, towards a shared emancipatory end. So my view is that one of the things that got dropped out of postmodernism was incredulity towards meta-narratives. I don't think that they have generally shared incredulity towards meta-narratives. I think that was one sentence that that Lyotard said once. I think it's something that you could get from that early high deconstructive phase of postmodernism, but I think that's dropped out. And you can see it in the activist literature. So this is Beautiful Trouble, a toolkit for revolution. This is a left-wing instruction manual or toolkit for engaging in protest. We find in this book, Cultural Hegemony. That's Antonio Gramsci's idea. Antonio Gramsci was a Marxist. We also have a section on intellectuals and power using the ideas of Michel Foucault. So how do they make that work? The way to think about them is not to use our sort of Enlightenment liberal Western rationalistic conceptions of how academics should proceed. They are not like careful academics slowly, piece by piece, adding one thing to another and making sure it all fits. They're rather like cooks in the kitchen. Oh, we have some post-structuralism. Oh, some Marxist theory, yes. Oh, some Foucault, a little bit of Derrida, mixing some Horkheimer and Adorno, a little skepticism.
Churn it all up and pump it out.
Yummy. Social justice. So what's happened is all of these ideas have been kind of mixed together into a stew. And what that stew kind of looks like, I'm going to read one quote by Sandra Harding, and then I'm going to get right into exactly how this kind of works out. In one of her articles, Harding writes, the adequacy, so she's talking about standpoint epistemology. And she says, the adequacy of standpoint projects is to be judged by the success of the practices they legitimate rather than the truth or verisimilitude of the representations of nature and social relations. In brackets, she says, recollect that the success of practices has always been the ultimate test of adequacy of certain claims. Do they in fact produce more accurate, comprehensive, rationally justifiable, and politically useful knowledge for the exploited group to which they are accountable? So, what you're seeing here is a replacement. The ultimate standard which judges epistemology is no longer, is it true? The question is, does it do the work of legitimizing the practices of the oppressed group which is making use of it? And so what's happened here is that the standard or the ultimate final judge of the epistemology is not truth or what is true. The ultimate judge of the epistemology is not, does this give us truth? Does this allow us to build knowledge which is anchored to the world correctly? No. The question is, does this give us a way to justify and to legitimize the practices which allow us to pursue our political ideology and our political ends? This is a political project. Okay?
So in that sense, postmodernism is definitely alive and well today.
That's right. That is absolutely correct. And one of the things that Searle talks about is the politicization of the academy. He actually writes several articles about this, and he says that explicitly, that what's going on here is there is, how does he put it? He says that they quite rightly realized that their political ideology could not survive contact with the Western rationalistic tradition because it would just get ripped apart. And so instead, they've sought about deconstructing the Western rationalistic tradition because it gets in the way. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense. It's getting in the way of their political achievements that they're trying to bring about. And that's just one facet of it in that. Yes, that makes perfect sense.
That's right. So this is what Searle says. If the relation of the Western rationalistic tradition to the traditional ideas of the university is more or less obvious, the relation between the attacks on the Western rationalistic tradition and proposal for educational reform is much less obvious. It is simply a fact that, in recent history, the rejection of the Western rationalistic tradition has gone hand in hand with the proposals for politically motivated changes in the curriculum. So what is the connection? I think the relationships are very complex, and I do not know of any simple answer to the question. But underlying all the complexity there is, I believe, this simple structure. Those who want to use the universities, especially the humanities, for leftist political transformation correctly perceive that the Western rationalistic tradition is an obstacle in their path. In spite of their variety, most of the challengers to the traditional conception of education correctly perceive that if they are forced to conduct academic life according to a set of rules determined by constraints of truth, objectivity, clarity, rationality, logic, and the brute existence of the real world, their task is made more difficult, perhaps impossible. For example, if you think that the purpose of teaching the history of the past is to achieve social and political transformation of the present, then the traditional canons of historical scholarship, the canons of objectivity, evidence, close attention to the facts, and above all, truth, can sometimes seem unnecessary and an unnecessary and oppressive regime that stands in the way of achieving more important social objectives. In my experience, at least, the present multiculturalist reformers of higher education did not come to a revised conception of education from a refutation of the Western rationalistic tradition. Rather, they sought a refutation of the Western rationalistic tradition that would justify a revised conception of education that they already found appealing. So what's going on here is that the postmodern deconstructive methods and the social constructivist methods are being used to dissolve our Western rationalistic tradition and our canons of objectivity, neutrality, and truth in order to serve a political agenda, which is why so much of this stuff is found in the social justice literature. The thing that stands in their way is the traditional canons of truth, logic, reason, objectivity. You can see this, what this looks like on the ground. If we want to talk about it on the ground, how all of this has metabolized into the culture is very often now a particular doctrine, for example, say, complementarianism, or the atonement, or that Jesus Christ is both fully man or fully God, or fully man and fully God, or that Jesus Christ is a male, or that God the Father should be conceptualized in a masculine way. Oftentimes, these are not refuted on the basis of truth. These are not refuted on the basis of a historical and grammatical understanding of the text. They're refuted on the basis of which discourses they feed into, which cultural biases they flatter, which people they are perceived to give power, whose interests they serve, who benefits from these doctrines. And that's how the analysis goes forward. And you can see this in the work of people like Robin Henderson Espinosa is an example of someone who does this. Beth Allison Barr does this. Kristen Cobb Dumais does this, and Thea Butler does this. John Caputo does this. The question for these people is in many cases not what is true, but they say whose truth, true for whom, and who does it benefit to believe this? And so the question they ask is not one of truth, but rather one of interests, of biases. And they say, look, you're a subjective person. You can't escape your cultural biases. So all your claims to truth are really loaded with implications for interests and power and biases. And they will attempt to undermine, undercut, and otherwise subvert the truth claims that you make on that basis. And what's lurking behind all of that is a postmodern understanding of the world. So one of the things that Kristen Cobb Dumais has done is to say, look, yeah, I'm vaguely influenced by Foucault. But she also says that one of her most important mentors was Gail Betterman. And in Gail Betterman's book, she says, I can't remember the name of the title of the book just off the top of my head right now. But Betterman says that she's using a purely Foucaultian view of the world, and that she's bringing this to bear, and that in Betterman's view, this is a recent development. But when you get to Dumais, all of a sudden that's dropped out. When Christy Dotson, the philosopher, talks about epistemic violence and saying that the rejection that it's epistemically violent to not take seriously certain ideas in favor of other ideas. When she says that, she cites Spivak, but she doesn't cite Foucault. So a lot of times the tracks of the postmodern thinkers are buried. They are kind of, the roots are kind of under the ground, but the trunk and the leaves and the fruit are coming out. Manliness and Civilization, that's the book. That's the name of Betterman's book. It's
Manliness. It always hits you, doesn't it? They hit you out of nowhere.
Right. But Manliness and Civilization is a takeoff of what? Madness and Civilization by Foucault. Betterman is a full Foucaultian. And so when Kristen Dumais is taking Betterman's work and using it, that's purely Foucaultian, but the Foucault citations have been dropped out. And so that inevitably leaves us to people like Jill, what's her name? Jill Hicks Keaton, who is I believe a professor of religion. And one of the things that Keaton says in an article is she's interacting with Beth Allison Barr's book. And what she says is, in the same way that Beth Allison Barr historicizes the interpretations that lead to complementarianism, but holds the doctrine of inerrancy, Jill Hicks Keaton says, but look, we can historicize the doctrine of inerrancy and ask who benefits, whose interests are served. And that's kind of the point, is that Jill Hicks Keaton is right. It's not merely when Dumais and Barr try to do this dance where they say, look, we're not saying that the text is inerrant. We're saying that the interpretation of the text might not be inerrant. The whole point that Jill Hicks Keaton is saying is, look, if you take a postmodern view of the world, the idea of inerrancy is itself up for grabs. And then you might step back and you could say, well, you know what else is up for grabs? The standards of truth. It's not just, is inerrancy true? And that's up for grabs. It's the standard of truth is up for grabs. And what's the ultimate standard for all of these people? It's what Mark Lila called that ill-defined impulse towards emancipation, or that ill-defined conception of emancipation. That's what's going on here. It's that leftist political transformation, which is that they're seeking, and the postmodern ideas are selected and moved and reconfigured and woven together in the service of that. And so what they're doing is a form of politically motivated subjectivism on postmodern assumptions, so that all of the standards are socially constructed, that the standards of truth are socially constructed, that the canons of rationality, logic, and reason are all socially constructed, and socially constructed by people who had interests and biases and whatever else. That is their view. And so when Alison Bailey, in her book on privilege preserving epistemic pushback, writes, she explicitly says this. She says, there is a critical thinking tradition which says that the idea is to get logic, reason, rationality correct so that we can fix bad propositions by getting our epistemic adequacy on point. She says there's a different tradition, which is the critical theory tradition, and the critical theory tradition is not looking at epistemic adequacy. The critical theory tradition sees the claims that people make as expressions of power, and then seeks to analyze them in terms of who benefits, whose interests are served, and how power is redistributed on the basis of particular statements and whether those statements are accepted or not. When a statement is accepted or not, whose statement is it? Who does it benefit? Who is taken seriously in the conversation? Who has their ideas validated? Whose interests are served? And that is what they mean by critical. And so what's happening is that the postmodern view, the anti-essentialist view of the world, social constructivist view of the world, meets up with the critical theoretical understanding of what it means to be critical. Those two things are fused together, and that is the tool set moving forward that's used to analyze the world. So all of the interpretations are socially constructed, and then we're criticizing those interpretations according to who benefits, whose interests are served, and what agenda is being forwarded, and who gets power and why. And you can see this all over Kristen Dumais' work. You can see it all over Beth Allison Barr's work. You can see it all over John Caputo's work. All of it. It's all postmodern. What's dropped out of the postmodernism is the playful nihilism, the abject relativism, and the idea that every interpretation is as good as every other interpretation. No, they have a standard now. And that standard is, according to their ill-defined or conveniently ill-defined leftist political transformation vision. That's what they're aiming at. That's what's the standard. The standard is, does this advance our political ends? And so the standard by which all of this are judged is, as Sandra Harding said, does it serve the interests of the oppressed group which is seeking power, which is trying to get it? That's the new standard. And that's how that fits together.
And that's precisely what we're saying when we're looking at this idea of coming back to our analogy of, you know, when evangelicals were dealing with postmodernism, they weren't dealing with this form of postmodernism
That's right.
that was existing out there. They were dealing with an older form of it. So is postmodernism dead? Well, certain aspects of that older form either have fallen off or they're not as influential. But the reality is that they've morphed and changed and kept infusing their ways into the critical tradition. And if anybody's followed anything in society over the last few years, postmodernism in that expression of it, and its later forms of it, is alive and well in our society.
Yes.
And when you look at the evangelical church, some of the figures that you've listed, they're clearly buying into postmodernism. And some people might say, well, those are more of the leftist versions and the left wing of Christendom. Well, we see these things expressed even in the right wing of Christendom. I mean, you know, the Southern Baptist Convention for the last several years has been debating this whole issue of social justice and critical theory. And when you see the political notions and the reality of what critical theory is and its postmodern influence and its political influence, it's not merely just an analytical tool. It's a very driven tool for specific purposes to achieve specific ends, for raising people into specific aspects of power.
That's right.
In addition to it, when people are giving these expressions like, well, I'm just a white man reading this text and I have my biases and there are things that I'm not seeing. And then you see other people saying, well, who's going to give the right text? Is it going to be the African reading or the Asian reading or the Hispanic reading? These are all drinking from the well of postmodernism, even if they're not explicitly saying it. Just sort of like the tree that you see is clearly drinking the water from the roots that you don't see that's already been laid there. And this social expression of it is the outworking of the foundation that's already been laid there from earlier and previous generations. And now when people are saying, well, you know, you can't have these interpretations, or you can't have an objective interpretation, they just take it as a given. It's just, yeah, this is the way it is. Sort of your whole analogy of who cites gravity anymore. Now it's just like, who cites these things anymore? We just take them as a given. And that seems to be where so much of the evangelical world is today. And that's how the social justice movement's worked its way in. One more comment, and then I'll turn it back here real quick, is that I've said for a number of years, evangelicals are clearly buying into this whole broader critical theory movement. And they ask, well, where did they get it from? And I say, in many ways, they were already primed with it.
Yes.
They've already come from their previous education. But specifically within the evangelical world, they get it from their hermeneutics department.
Yes.
You know, they're not saying, oh, we're getting this from these specific readers. But I'll tell you, when you go and you pick up a standard evangelical hermeneutics text today, whether it be the hermeneutical spiral or whether it be different things coming from like Janine Brown or coming from the Dictionary of Theological Interpretation, they're assuming this context. And when people are buying into that in their greater hermeneutic, it's only a difference of degree for them to then start buying into the broader critical theory, social justice movement that's pervasive throughout so much of evangelicalism.
And so this is where I'm going to say two things. I'm going to read something again, because I like to cite my sources so we can get down that distinction between critical pedagogy. Then I'm going to touch on the hermeneutics thing.
Okay.
This is Alison Bailey in her paper, Tracking Privilege, Preserving Epistemic Pushback. She says, the critical thinking tradition is concerned primarily with epistemic adequacy. To be critical is to show good judgment in recognizing when arguments are faulty, assertions lack evidence, truth claims appeal to unreliable sources, or concepts are sloppily crafted and applied. In this tradition, sloppy claims can be identified and fixed by learning to apply the tools of formal and informal logic correctly. Critical pedagogy begins from a different set of assumptions rooted in the neo-Marxian literature on critical theory commonly associated with the Frankfurt School. Here, the critical learner is someone who is empowered and motivated to seek justice and emancipation. Critical pedagogy regards the claims that students make in response to social justice issues not as propositions to be assessed for their truth value, but as expressions of power that function to reinscribe and perpetuate social inequalities. Its mission is to teach students ways of identifying and mapping how power shapes our understanding of the world. This is the first step towards resisting and transforming social injustices. By interrogating the politics of knowledge production, this tradition also calls into question the uses of the accepted critical thinking toolkit to determine epistemic adequacy. So no, critical pedagogy is not just an analytical tool. It's normative. It has a very, very strong normative dimension to it. It is not merely that how would you say it? It is not merely that it's this sort of empty vessel that can be, or it's not like a hammer where you can just use it however you want. It's got normative political implications built right into it intentionally. And it is, as Bailey says, going to be used to question from the perspective of a left-wing politics, the epistemic adequacy of the critical thinking toolkit. In other words, the tools that were designed to forward a political agenda will be the tools that are used to judge whether or not your truth-providing toolkit is good. Rather than saying, wait.
We know where that's going to end every time.
Yeah. Shouldn't we be taking the truth toolkit and figuring out whether your politics are any good? That's what we ought to be doing.
It's very exactly. I mean, it's self-serving in this sense to allow your standards of truth to also be the judge upon which your whole view is being pushed forward in that sense. And it's a very self-serving theory in that regard. And that's specifically what's going on here. When it's applied into institutions, it's not an issue of asking whether or not it's true. They then immediately start calling you into question whether you have the ability to even critique this or to give a proper definition of this. And you're never adequate. It's always they're the ones that are adequate. And then if you start to push back against this, they start saying, well, you have a social agenda for it. You're coming from elements of privilege and power. But when the ironic thing is that, you know, take the concept of social agenda in and of itself, their whole theory is wedded to a specific social agenda.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you know, it's going back to what James Lindsay has said and his whole DARVO concepts. DARVO is the acronym of, you know, deny, accuse, and reverse the roles of victim and oppressor. You know, you come up to them, you say, you're clearly political on what you're doing here. And they, no, we're not being political. They then accuse you of it. And they get you caught in this wizardry of what's coming back and forth. And that's where their game is playing. And that's where postmodernism is alive and well
they always,
today.
They hijack the intuition that we want to be skeptical of powerful people. Fair enough. Right? I mean, I want to be skeptical of powerful people. But the sleight of hand is to say that the only interests which can corrupt someone's view are the interests of the powerful. Your interests, if you say not a member of a powerful class, can't corrupt your view. Well, why accept that? Why would it be that only the interests of powerful people can have a corrupting influence on their ability to perceive truth? There's no reason to believe that at all. In fact, I can see no reason. If you have an interest, if you have an agenda, if you have a set of goals, if you have a set of politics, even if you're morally right, if you fudge the truth in favor of your moral rightness, you're still fudging the truth. And so if you say, well, truth will be determined by my morality, then wait, what determines whether or not your morality is based in truth?
Exactly.
Or is it just at that point reduces to interests? Well, why should we think that your moral system is correct? What is the judge of your moral system if your moral system is the standard of everything? And in critical theory, the leftist political ideology and moral set and moral value set is the ultimate standard. That's the point. Okay, so now I'm going to say two things and then we'll finish up. First off, a primer on postmodernism, 1996. Postmoderns reject the possibility of constructing a single correct worldview and are content to simply speak of many views and by extension many worlds. This is the intersectional thing come to life, right? As a black, Hispanic, disabled person, well, as a white, Jewish, able-bodied, heterosexual, as a transgender, right? They're all labeling out their identities and their standpoints and their positions, and then saying, by replacing the modern worldview with a multiplicity of views and worlds, the postmodern era has in effect replaced knowledge with interpretation. I love all of my Christian brothers, but Actions, Reasons, and Causes by Donald Davidson. It's wrong, but the way that he reasons through things is important to know and understand. Language, Truth, and Logic by A.J. Iyer. He gets a lot wrong, but it's important to understand. And it's important to read him. I had a philosophy professor once say that Alfred A.J. Ayer's book stated logical positivism so clearly that after that, nobody could have believed it. Because it was obviously wrong. Empiricism, Semantics, and Ontology by Rudolf Carnap. The Two Dogmas of Empiricism by Willard Van Orman Quine. All of this stuff is important in the history of philosophy of language, and we need to read it and understand it. But the postmoderns came along and were attacking that very tradition. And part of the way they did it is to say that, look, there is no inherent objective, correct, proper, right meaning that can be pulled out of the text, because whatever interpretation you have of the text is just your interpretation. And when somebody else reads your interpretation, all they have is their interpretation of your interpretation of the text. The Death of the Author by Roland Barthes, all of that stuff. Most of, if not all of the confusions, the postmodern confusions around language can be resolved by reading John Searle. He's an atheist, and he gets into trouble with his theory of mind, because as an atheist materialist, he does not, in my view, provide a compelling answer to the question of the ontology of mind. J.P. Moreland in 97 had it right when he said that Searle's emergence theory of mind is a name where a theory ought to be. I think Moreland got that right. But Searle's view of language and meaning, I think, is bang on. And what Searle gets right is that meaning, language, action, perception, all of this is grounded in the mind and grounded in consciousness. And that a proper understanding of things doesn't allow us to have like this thing called an interpretation over here and this thing called the meaning of the text over here, and then never the twain shall meet. That sort of idea of, well, you just have your interpretation. Searle says no. No, there are objective meanings in texts, and we can pull them out. Now, sometimes the meanings can be blurred. Sometimes we may not be able to perceive the meaning. Sometimes people create things with open-ended meaning. That's true. But sometimes people are saying something very specific. And they're saying very concise and correct or concise and specific propositions. And it's not just a matter of interpretation. That's wrong. And I think a lot of the kind of slipperiness in language could be dealt with a better understanding of language. And I think a lot of that is going to be able to come out of John Searle. So I said before, I'm this odd mix of Pentecostal and of analytic philosophy. I think if you understand how language works, a lot of the hermeneutical nonsense simply falls apart. None of it holds together if you actually understand philosophy of language and understand it well. If you understand the role that intentionality plays in meaning and language, if you understand what a derivative intentionality is, if you understand the world to mind and mind to world directions of fit, if you understand all of that, it's a lot easier to make sense and to rip apart these postmodern deconstructions and blurrings of meanings. And I think that Christians need to start picking up some of this stuff and getting back into it, because as much as people love Swinburne and Plantinga and Moreland and these other guys, and I love them too, there's a lot of the tools that the postmoderns are using are not coming from that tool set. And the people who pushed back, I think, most successfully against the postmoderns were the people who were in that world of philosophy of language as it was going on. And I think the best expression of that probably comes from John Searle. And so I would highly, highly recommend that people pick up Intentionality by John Searle, Rationality in Action, that they read his essay against Derrida in Theory's Empire. I believe it's called Interpretation and Its Discontents, or Theory and Its Discontents. Expression and Meaning. All of that stuff is very, very good. I mean, he's not completely right about anything. I mean, Plantinga went after him on his cluster theory of names back in the 70s, and there's things that we could pick about. But broadly speaking, his theory of intentionality and the way that connects to language and meaning is correct. And his theory of speech acts, I mean, he shifts from his original work in speech acts to some of his later stuff in Rationality in Action and through intentionality in the middle there. But he's right. His work is very important, and we have to understand how language works in order to understand how these guys are slipping and sliding and playing these interpretive games and these hermeneutical games. It's super important, and until we start getting in on that, this postmodern stuff is going to fly right under the radar. They are going to interpret their way out of reality, and that's the problem.
We very much learned here that postmodernism is alive and well, but it's changing its face on a daily basis. And we need to be equipped to deal with the postmodernism that is alive here and now. Now, we realize that people have done great work in critiquing a postmodernism of the past, but in many respects, we've chopped the head off of one aspect and it grew three more.
Yes.
And what I want you guys to see here is that this is a form of wizardry that can put you in a proverbial spell. And I think James Lindsay pointed this out at a conference that we did in Phoenix when he was talking about sort of dispelling the spell of what really became the critical theory that's just driving so many things today, and all of its sort of Gnostic hermeticisms and different concepts there that are just so relevant to this conversation. Yeah. So let's just summarize with this, guys. Postmodernism has a variety of different terms and definitions of it. Let's not equivocate on our understanding of postmodernism. Let's see what the postmodernists are actually doing with the language itself and the way that it's functioning. Let's also realize that they are setting one aspect of the conversation. And like we said in our old analogy, it's not as though the fighting weapons of the past are completely irrelevant. Sure. Clearly, arguments for the existence of God are valid and sound, and our arguments for the resurrection and for the total truthfulness and inerrancy of the Bible, these things are still effective, alive, and well. But one thing that apologists need to realize is that there's a whole milieu of people out there that are thinking in a different way, and we need to be ready and equipped to deal with them where they're at on these particular topics. So, Wokal, can you give us a couple lines of final conclusion here?
I would encourage, on that point about philosophy of language, there's a volume called Theory's Empire, an Anthology of Dissent. Searle has an essay in there called Literary Theory and Its Discontents. People should read that. They should read, if I can just pull it up here, just so I can get the Rationality and Realism, What is at Stake by John Searle, and Daedalus and Fall of 1993. People should read that. I think people should be reading, they should read this, Cynical Theories. While they're at it, it would probably be useful to read this, The Rebel Cell by Andrew Potter and Joseph Heath. There was a recent volume published called Cooperation and Social Justice by Joseph Heath. That's also another essay that's important to read. And really, people have got to get their minds around, and apologists have to start understanding the conceptual games and the language games that are being played right now in the milieu of the academic world outside of Christian apologetics. You are not going to be fighting the Sam Harrises and Richard Dawkins. The days of William Lane Craig fighting up against, going up against Richard Dawkins in a toe-to-toe debate on the existence of God, those days are in large part, I would say, they're over. They're over. Like, that's probably not going to be happening again for a very long time. And so we need to understand what's actually being asked and the problems that are actually showing up. So in that spirit, I will finish by reading a very brief thread. A long time ago, I said, the faith struggles of young people aren't like past generations. It's not the problem of evil or scientific atheism that's a problem. And the standard apologetics of the Kalam cosmological argument or presuppositional apologetics for Plantinga can't get traction. Today's young people aren't asking, does God exist, or what about evil? The big questions of the people are asking different questions, and those questions are not what young people struggle with. The big questions of life fit into four categories. Where did we come from? What's the purpose of life? How do we live, and what will become of us? What people want to know is, where did I come from? Why am I here? How should I live, and what will happen to me? And the struggle of today's young people is about meaning. They live in a world where nothing is stable, and they are constantly told everything, including every aspect of their identity, is socially constructed. They live in a deconstructed world where everything is constantly interpreted and reinterpreted, and they're bombarded from all angles. Meaning, both linguistically and in terms of purpose, is just under the question of is under the surface of every question they ask. So much of the depression, anxiety, self-doubt, malaise, and existential angst of young people is caused by the absence of meaning and purpose. It's all been deconstruction and said to be merely the product of linguistic systems or power relations or arbitrary cultural norms. In a deconstructed world, there's nothing transcendent or objective to serve as a linchpin for meaning and purpose. Everything that was seen as meaningful or purposeful is deconstructed and, according to the deconstructors, shown to be nothing more than an arbitrary social construct having no more objective meaning or purpose than anything else. Meaning is a social illusion. And in the deconstructed world, the transcendent is replaced by the socially constructed knockoff. The truth is replaced by opinion and consensus. The good is replaced by wants and pleasures, and the beautiful is replaced by taste and style. The beautiful is replaced by taste and style. In a deconstructed world, there's no objective meaning or purpose. It's all been wiped away. And that's where we are now. We need to look at meaning. We don't need to show that young people God exists, or even that the Bible is true. We need to convince them that God would matter if he existed, and that the Bible had meaning to begin with. It's not that people think Christianity is wrong, it's that they think it doesn't matter. Meaning is the thing that matters, and we need to understand the nihilistic despair that lies at the heart of postmodernism and figure out how to inject and hope and meaning into a world of nihilistic cynicism and despair. That is where we are at. And until we can get a hold of that and undermine the silly arguments that say that every time you try to elevate something to the level of goodness or truth or beauty, that, oh, that's just a power relation, or that's just privileging, oh, that's just... We need to get rid of this. And so I want the apologetics community to turn their eye to this and see that the assumptions and presuppositions of the social justice movement as they launder through are going to dissolve everything, including the movement itself. And you can see it in the pride flag. It used to be a simple rainbow. Now it's a black and a white bar and a rainbow and a triangle and a trans flag, and then a little yellow thing, and then there's a purple circle, because it will just endlessly fragment as each of the identities fights for prominence. So we don't want to go down that road, and we need to be paying attention, because, by the way, the questions that your kids are going to start asking as they're coming through the school system are not going to be, what about Richard Dawkins? That's not what they're going to ask. They're going to say, why should we accept the interpretation which says God is omnipotent? I mean, Caputo already wrote a book against omnipotence, and he calls himself a Christian. So we need to be, or he's been lumped in with Christianity, to say the least. So if the academics practicing this stuff are denying omnipotence, where do we think that's going to end up? I mean, this is just filtering into the culture now. The denial of omnipotence, the denial of the Nicene Creed, that's already happened. The deconstruction has already occurred. The question is, are the apologists going to sit and stand with the doctrine, or are they going to say, well, you know, other people with PhDs deconstructed already, we have to accept it. So, read Literary Theory and Its Discontents by John Searle. Read Rationality and Realism, What's at Stake by John Searle. Get your mind around language and let's go, because we've got work to do.
And with that, thank you, Wokal. We really appreciate it. We are going to benefit from this. I hope the apologetics world listens to so much of what you've had to say here, and hopefully we can turn the tides with this. That's the goal. We are here to defend the historic Christian faith and the age in which we live, and this is the age in which we live. So again, thank you. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.